Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everybody to Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice. I am Terry Dennis, the chair of the committee. With us today we have Mr. Gary Gruwell, Mr. Travis Kiesig, Ms. Lisa Lambert, Mr. Tim McLeod, Mr. Greg Ottenbright, and subbing in for Ms. Erica Ritchie is Mr. Nathaniel Teed. Today, this committee will be considering two bills before the consideration of the committee resolutions before for the 2023-2024 estimates and the 2022-2023 supplementary estimates number 2. We will begin with Bill number 125, the Cannabis Control Saskatchewan Amendment Act 2022. Ms. Carr is here with her officials. As a reminder to the officials, please state your name for the record and do not touch the mics. Hansard operator will turn them on for you. Minister, please introduce your officials and give your opening comments.
Great, thank you very much. So with me today is Fiona Cribb, Vice President of Regulatory Services, and Lynette Skalrud, Director of Policy and Legislation. So before we get into your questions, I would like to provide a quick update on the legislation we are here to discuss. The Cannabis Control Saskatchewan Amendment Act 2022 establishes the provincial legal framework to authorize First Nations to license and regulate the distribution and retailing of cannabis on reserve. The changes in legislation will allow SLGA to enter into agreements with First Nations that have established a First Nation Cannabis Authority to license and regulate on-reserve cannabis sales and distribution. Once a First Nations cannabis regulator is established under the provisions of the Act, First Nation stores regulated by First Nation cannabis regulators will have access to federally regulated cannabis products. This will improve the safety of cannabis products being distributed on reserve while further eroding black market in cannabis. The change further fosters reconciliation by ensuring First Nations can fully participate in the economic opportunities of the regulated cannabis industry. In addition to the changes described above, the amendments will also address an irritant to both consumers and retailers by removing the requirement that all individuals entering a cannabis store or making a purchase provide ID. With that, I'll end my remarks and take any questions that anyone may have.
Thank you, Minister. I'll open it up for questions. Mr. Teed.
Left remarks during adjourned debates, so I'm going to jump right into questions if that's all right. My first question is just broadly, what stakeholder groups were engaged during this amendment of this legislation?
Great. So, SLGA and Justice have been in ongoing discussions with several First Nations over the past few years. While those First Nations have expressed a preference that government formally recognize their inherent jurisdiction over on-reserve cannabis sales, they do see this approach as a good compromise that allows them to access the legal supply of cannabis without giving up the jurisdiction.
Thank you so much. Did they have any advice for SLGA during the process as to the best process of making this legislation a reality, kind of recognizing their self-governance rights?
Yeah, for sure. As we were having those discussions with different individuals, what they did express is obviously they don't want to lose the rights that they have, but they did see the framework that we have and how that could work within their system. So obviously we're going to set this up, and it is opt-in. They have the option to do this, or they can do what they're doing.
Thank you. What supports are being offered to First Nations who would like to open stores, plus some of the nations that may not already have engaged in this? Are there any specific supports that the government is offering those folks?
I think what I would say to that is basically what we have is the regulatory framework that is already set up and that they will be able to access. So they'll be able to access our professionals as they're setting up their store. That would be the form of support that we would give.
Thank you. Moving on to Check 25, I just thought I would had a few questions about what supports and programs are in place to ensure that retailers are prepared for this transition. You know, I know we had for our SLJ stores, there's things about serving intoxicated or folks who are partaking, ensuring IDs are being checked. Just wondering what like educational resources are being put out.
So there's already a program that retailers are expected to take when they open up stores called Canicel, and it talks about the rules and regulations about IDing people. And of course, up to this point, you've had to ID everybody that comes in the store. So right now, we're just changing that to 25. As a rule, you can normally judge if someone's approximately that age or if they're much younger than that. And this is the practice that we already use in all of our liquor outlets as well. So it is something that has worked. And so now that the stores have been up and running, we see that it's working. We decided to just make it even across the board.
And are there, what are the processes that SLG has in place to ensure that retailers are following along with those regulations?
So we do have the inspectors that go out and randomly check on stores as their day-to-day work. But one of the things that we also do is it's called the Minors Test Program. So we will send people in who are minors and get them to try and buy a product and test to see if our retailers are actually following the rules.
Any data on the like what you're seeing from that or efficacy or things like that?
So I think to date with cannabis, everybody's had to be ID'd. So we don't have any numbers to date.
That's
Yeah.
very fair. I know I've asked this before, and I recently took some media questions about it. And I've been hearing feedback from stakeholders. I know we've opted to liquor consumption in public spaces. So I thought I would ask again: do you have any plans to align cannabis with public consumption of alcohol at this time, or are there thoughts looking into that down the road?
Not at this time. We're actually just going to monitor the market and see what's happening in other jurisdictions and just take it from there.
Thank you so much. That's all the questions that I have today.
Thank you, Mr. T. Seeing no more questions, we will proceed to vote on the clauses. Clause 1, short title, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 2, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 3, is that agreed? Carried. Sorry. Clause 4, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 5, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 6, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 7, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 8, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 9, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 10, two pages. Clause 10, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 11, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 12, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 13, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 14, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 15, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 16, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 17, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 18, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 19, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 20, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 21, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 22, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 23, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 24, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 25, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 26, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 27, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 28, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 29, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 30, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 31, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 32, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 33, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 34, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 35, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 36, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 37 coming into force, is that agreed? Carried. His Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan, enacts the follows. The Cannabis Control Saskatchewan Amendment Act 2022. I'd ask a member that we move the report, Bill number 125, the Cannabis Control Saskatchewan Amendment Act 2022 without amendment. Mr. Kiesig?
I do so move, Mr. Chair.
Is that agreed? Carried. Is there any closing comments, Minister?
I guess just briefly, I'd like to thank everybody for being here today, the members and Hansard, and of course my support staff that are always here. And Mr. T, thank you for the thoughtful questions.
Mr. T, do you have any questions?
Just thank you as well to the thanks to the minister for taking the questions today. Thank you so much for bringing your officials here today. To my fellow committee members, thank you so much, and the chair, appreciate the time today.
Thank you. We'll now have a brief recess while we change committees.